Thank you for coming to this final parallel session. The parallel session behind us in the classroom is going to be exploring international solidarity actions. However, on this panel, we will also be engaging in conversations around international dynamics and solidarity actions. So you can get the best of both worlds if you just stay here. My name's Guppi. We met earlier today. It's very last minute that I'm facilitating this conversation because, unfortunately, if you came for Victoria from People Dem Collective, she got ill at Glasgow. I'm sort of like slightly sad for her, but not that sad. But she got COVID, so I am actually very sad for her. And not just the fact that she's not here, but her expertise and wisdom in this particular conversation would have been such a beautiful contribution to the discussion we were going to have. I will try my best to bring that, and hopefully we can set up another session with her at some point in the future. The title of this conversation is If We Are Not Prepared to Govern, We're Not Prepared to Win. I mentioned earlier in the panel plenary with Nonny that one of our kind of guiding strategies for decolonising economics is the movement generation just transition strategy framework. And if we're not prepared to govern, we're not prepared to win is one of the sort of like rules of moving towards a regenerative economy. And on the panel today, we're going to be discussing multiple forms of how we collectively organize towards governance models and ownership models that meet the principles of the solidarity economy, and how we do that in an extractive economy that prioritizes individual ownership and very extractive models of forms of financing for things like assets and homes. So how do we convert those into places in which we can create safety and security for generations to come? I'm going to allow the panel to introduce themselves in a more fuller way. This is a very standard format for a plenary discussion, conversation and questions from me, and then we'll open it up to the floor, and we'll hopefully finish by 4:30, so you have a break before the final session. Shall we begin? Great. Okay, you want to begin over here? Angelique. Please. Yeah, let's go. Angelique, would you like to introduce yourself, your organising, and maybe a little bit about how your organising work sort of aligns with this question of moving towards collective ownership and self-governance?
You don't ask for much, do you? Yeah, so I'm Angelique. I do a number of things. I am doing a PhD at the University of Bristol, and I'll just tell you just very, very briefly about it, because a lot of my answers to some of the questions I might draw on that, so having some kind of context might be useful. So it is, what is it about? It's about, I've only been doing it for 6 years. It's about, I suppose very broadly, it's about indigenous approaches to development. But obviously that's very broad, so I've focused it down a bit. It's about housing specifically. It's about housing in townships in Cape Town, South Africa. In the context of Southern Africa, the indigenous approach that we're talking about is Ubuntu. So how can this philosophical approach of Ubuntu add to a more sustainable route to housing in townships in Cape Town? But obviously, I suppose indigenous approaches to development and well, to anything really, has become a bit of a buzzword in academia. But there's not a lot of talk about how to actually operationalize those philosophies. It's very abstract, it's very big, right? And so I suppose what my research is trying to do is to operationalize it. And to do that, it is using the model of social enterprise as a vehicle through which Ubuntu can be operationalized. Anyway, that's what it's about. I also work at Black Southwest Network, which is a racial justice organization in Bristol. And we do a number of things there. One of the biggest projects I will probably talk about is I don't know when it was probably a year or two ago maybe, Bristol City Council had, they've got a policy called the Land Disposal Scheme. And through that so it's like sort of, small plots of land that the government is getting rid of to getting rid of, you know what I mean, to community ownership. And so we bid in partnership with another organisation called We Can Make. And if you don't know We Can Make, I highly recommend that you look them up. Anyway, so we bid in partnership with them for 2 of the plots of land, and we were successful. I suppose the issue that I will draw on later on in the discussion that we're having now is about actually financing the development of that land. So it's all well and good having the land, and that's great and it's fantastic. But there's no further funding beyond that. It's like, hey, here's some land and off you go kind of thing. So I will draw on that a little bit more, but I don't want to talk too much further. Thank you.
Thank you. Kwame.
Hi, everyone. My name's Kwame. I'm a co-founder and director of Kin Structures, along with Aman Nouri, who can't make it today. Kin Structures came from a very simple question. It was like a genuine question Aman and I asked each other, and it was, how can we create a permanent home for grassroots culture in London? And that question came from our massive love and passion for art and culture and the art and culture of London, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, but I think there's a story that's often told about that culture that doesn't necessarily speak about the support or the lack of support that culture has had to exist and to flourish. And so what we wanted to think about was actually what would a space that intentionally platformed and supported that culture look like. And I don't know how long I can speak for. I'm going to go into a bit of detail. I think it's really helpful. But the idea of a permanent home was really important at the time of us asking that question, because at that time there was a thing called meanwhile spaces, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, but if you're not, meanwhile spaces are when developers who have a plot of land or a building think about how they can monetize or use that basically vacant bit of land or building before they're ready to develop it. And so what they often do is they invite community groups, smaller organizations, social enterprises, and actually I think where we are today is actually a meanwhile space. And so what they often do is they invite those groups in to operate the space temporarily. And I think it's a very double-edged invitation in that it gives people space, which is obviously really valuable. What it also often involves is capitalizing on the capital of those groups. And it allows these developers to basically leverage that capital for their own benefit. And so it's actually, I think it's quite cynical. And it's also, it feeds into this culture of disposability in London, which you see all the time with certain communities, certain people, but also in the kind of culture around space in this city. And Aman and I really wanted to challenge that. And another really important part of us asking this question was around this kind of idea of culture for who and from what. And in London, in the London plan, for example, the kind of cultural spaces that are referred to are often bigger cultural institutions like the Tate, the Barbican. And we were struggling at this point as people who were involved in cultural work, as artists, to find spaces that actually treated us in a way that felt we could sustain our creativity in this city. And I think part of that is to do with planning. It's around the systems and the structures that govern space. And I think space is often the hidden sort of element in the production of culture and in the values and the value that is kind of manufactured through culture. And yes, space is often a hidden part of that. So we wanted to really kind of think about infrastructure. And we often talk about our work as infrastructural. And that's been massive in guiding the direction of our work. And just to kind of take you through some key moments in our journey. So we had this original question, And after that kind of like initial idea, we spoke to 20 people. 10 of them were like cultural workers and artists. 10 of them were community leaders from across the city. And through speaking to them, we landed on community centres as like a dormant infrastructure. So community centres, as these buildings that were built in the 20th century, they were purpose-built, they were strategically located, they're often on like council estates, they're on high streets, and they're just often under-resourced. And a lot of them still do amazing work, but it's against, I guess, a wider context of scarcity. 1 minute, okay. So I'm gonna like save some of the points of the story for later on, but what I'll just try and wrap up now is that our work has thought a lot about community centres and about how can community centres be thought of and resourced as alternative infrastructure for communities and for cultural work in London, but further beyond London. And we're currently located at the Soane Centre. It's a community centre in Marland, in Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park. It's a really beautiful space. It does really amazing work. It supports local primary school children to access nature and ecology through the use of the park as like an outdoor classroom. And almost single-handedly, somebody called Dim, who's the education lead for Set Point London East, shares the park with over 7,000 local school children every year, most of whom are black or brown. And it's an amazing resource. And what we've tried to do is integrate into that really like amazing offer and think about how it can be sustained. And we're seeing it as like a demonstration of what our vision for community centres could be. And we have a 10-year vision for that. That 10-year vision is like really intentional. It's because we think we need that amount of time to really embed ourselves and create a set of relationships and structures which are really nourishing and are really deep. And I'm going to end on that, but I just want to emphasize the point of relationships. A lot of our work is about relationships. And I think in the context of governance, that for me is like the sort of the underpinning of governance and its value is actually how does it sustain and support nourishing and lasting relationships? Because I think often governance is seen as something which is quite transactional and is maybe like a sort of add-on, but for us it's actually like foundational for everything that we want to do in this space. Yeah, I'll end there.
Claude.
Hey, good afternoon. Big up to all those who've been here all day and stuck through the weather. I sit here thinking when we talk about land and when we talk about ownership, I think about our brothers and sisters that just went through the hurricane in the Caribbean and, you know, other family members, other people we know that are going through turmoils around the world. Claude Hendrickson, I'm the founder of Frontline Self-Build, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. I've been banging this drum for community-led housing, community land trust for about 30 years. And it's really part of the community wealth building agenda. And later on, we'll get deeper into that. I'm also right now, for my sins, I would say, a member of the Right to Build task force. No, that's something else. I'm also a community-led advisor, accredited community-led advisor, and there's not many ethnic minority, people of colour, community-led advisors across the country. I am also the EDI trainer on the 4 Million Homes, and which is about residents and empowering residents. I just wanted to mention, because I know I'm going to be asked a lot of questions as we go through, I also wrote a 10-year strategy document for Leeds City Council, because I've come all the way down from Leeds up all the way up there in Yorkshire. A 10-year strategy for community-led housing to be part of the community, to be part of the solution to the housing crisis that the UK talks about having, and how can we be part of that solution rather than have it done for us? How can communities be part of solving that, and that would be with land as well. And it's quite funny because I spent the last 2 days on this piece of land, and last week I was up at Wolves Lane, which Ubele is doing land, and it's been a really enlightening feeling. Even though it's been raining all day today, you kind of felt that positive action because we're on land, because we can see the power of the situation. So I really want to just leave it there, and I'll take the questions when they come, because otherwise I'll be on longer than the two. And what I would like to say is Bristol, and we can make, I agree with you, I think what Melissa Means doing is fantastic. But Bristol holds a major place in my heart because the Zanzili project, which inspired me all them years ago, that group of men building their own houses. So yeah, I'll give you back the mic now.
So you were all given questions before you came. But I'm going to go a little bit off piece of the questions, but I think in a way that will hopefully allow your introductions to flow into the next part of the conversation. So as you can hear, each of the speakers is coming into this conversation, particularly around land and housing or community spaces or places to be together safely and securely from very different perspectives. And we're going to try and weave all of these together. So Claude, I'm going to ask you to also go a bit more into Frontline. And this is a project that came about, is it 30 years? 30 years ago, right? So like Claude is an absolute legend in having done a self-built project with a group of black men up in Leeds that still exists today. There's a video on YouTube that you can watch, but I really want you to speak to that experience and actually like what led you to a DIY process when you came to realize that no one was going to come and support you, but you had to go ahead and do it yourself and make that break. So just speaking about how you came to that project in a second. And then, and Angelique, I do want you, because you're right in the middle of your research, like to really bring into the conversation the perspectives of, indigenous principles and practice into the concepts of land and housing and how we can use that in challenging some of the structures that exist in the UK as we try to fight and build solidarity and I guess knowledge exchange between here and other countries in the global south, or formerly colonized countries, I'll say. And Kwame, you ended your piece on specifically the point that I would love you to explore, which is how a lot of this conversation could get and does get in when you come to like the technicalities of it, very detailed and like quite dull, quite like bureaucratic and lots of form filling. And so how do you as an organizer and as a leader in this space like hold the principles of relational organizing in some of the more technical bits of the work that you have to do, and like basically become the buffer for that and what that means for you and just for folks who are interested in that practice, the expectations that are required of you in that. So let's begin with Claude and then we'll go back round again.
Okay, thank you very much, Guppi. Like I mentioned, Frontline Self-Build. Frontline Self-Build happened 30 years ago, a group of, again, when there was a housing crisis. This housing crisis has been rolling on since the 60s. This housing crisis is not a problem of migration. It's a problem of Britain not being building enough houses for perpetuity. They've just not been doing it. One of the things, just to let you know, I feel is that social housing should be an infrastructure component. It should be something the system does regardless. Is that rain coming again? Yeah. Oh, that's good, because then you'll all come in and listen tight. So Frontline was a group of unemployed black men. And back then, when we went for Frontline, there was a myth that black Caribbean men didn't want to work. They wanted to do negative things. There was a myth that black men did not enjoy construction or want to go on construction sites, which kind of resonated with me in that as people of colour, wherever we come from, being involved in building your own house is the norm. And when I say that, even if you're a school teacher, if you're a policeman, if you're a fisherman, back in the countries where we originate from, you would push blocks, you would carry bricks, you would paint. Yeah, it's a natural phenomenon. You know, you don't sit and wait, you know, being involved in solving your own problems. So we as 12 unemployed men wanted to, well, for me, it was proving that we could do it. And just for mention of them, they laid 92,000 bricks, they laid 52,000 blocks, and they built 12 houses. Them houses still stand today, and if you go on YouTube, you can look at the video. And really, for me, a lot of the time it's about evidence. You know, there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of feeling, but it's about having the evidence that it can be done. And when you look across Britain, there's been projects before Frontline, Zanzili, there's been projects in Brixton, there's been projects in Birmingham, there's been projects in Liverpool where people of colour have taken on this task and delivered it. But for some reason, it's the, and as Khalid would say, it's the woolly jumper brigade that get all the options to do it. And when he talks about the woolly jumper brigade, he's talking about white, educated, middle-class people. They do self-build, they do land trust, they do this all of the time. You know, there's something like 26 land trust hubs in the country. Not one of them are black-led, not one of them are led by a person of colour. The one in Bristol was, to a point, Susan Kaldagi, and they've moved her on, so that hub doesn't really exist anymore. So I'm really been banging the drum to kind of get black and ethnic minority people to understand land and housing is part of our DNA, and we need to be getting more involved. There is opportunities, and along with the community wealth building agenda, the evidence is out there. You've got co-ops, and I'll speak about them a little later on, like Imani Housing Co-op in London. You've got housing co-ops in Brixton. You've got housing co-ops in Liverpool, where black and ethnic minority people are taking on the power of taking control of land and delivery. And when we talk about taking control of land, I look at a piece of land like they've got here. Land can have multi-purpose use. So, for example, on even a site like this, you could have some housing, you could have an adventure playground, and you could still have land for growing food. So when we talk about land, it's not just land for housing, it's multi-purpose use land, you know. And for me, and I'm just in the middle of doing some research as to why black and ethnic minorities are not more involved in land disposal, why we're not trying to set up community-led housing projects. And really, again, it's because they don't know about it. Not many people know. How many of you in here had heard about community-led housing or self-build before? How many of you know anybody that's been involved in it? So, and in Britain, self-build has been going since after the Second World War. You know, this has been going for hundreds of years. But black and ethnic minority people of colour don't know about it. So what I'll do, I'll hold fire there, because I know Guppi wants to have everybody have an input, so let me pass the mic.
I feel like when Oprah was like, what was it, silenced, or the silence thing? It's like, did they not know about it, or they kept on it, sort of thing as well? Yeah. So it's like that. that bit of it. Thanks, Claude. And we will come back to the co-ops and community land trusts. Maybe, Angelique, you'd like to go next? Yes, you're going to talk about the sort of importance of the importance of understanding indigenous principles and practices when we think about land and housing here, and what strength we get from building those connections, and how that can guide us when we think about assets, community assets, or collective spaces.
Yeah. So I'm really distracted by the cold. Do you know, I've been living here for like 15 years and I still cannot get used to the cold. Yeah. So I don't think you can talk about, community wealth building or solidarity in any kind of way without drawing on, indigenous approaches and indigenous philosophies, right? So Ubuntu, which is just one, right? It's just one indigenous philosophy from around the world, right? But they're all very similar. They all talk about mutual aid. They all talk about solidarity in some way, shape, or form. And Ubuntu, for example, the whole maxim is I am because we are, and you contrast that with the very kind of Western ideology of the pinnacle of research and academia, I think, therefore I am, right? It's so individual, it's so individualistic, versus this, I am, versus the Ubuntu approach, right? And how that then feeds into the approach to housing or to well-being in general. So I'm getting really distracted by the sound changes here. Yeah. So how that then feeds into well-being in South Africa, for example, it feeds into from anything like to how people greet each other in South Africa, to the fact that no one can be refused healthcare regardless of whether they can, afford it in South Africa. That all stems from this idea of Ubuntu, right? So it feeds into, every practice across the country. But I suppose if I can focus it down a little bit more into perhaps my research and some of the organizations that I've come across and the practices that they have. So there is a group called Mbadu Housing Group. They've just recently released their website, if you wanted to look them up. Mbadu Housing Group. And this is a group of 500 township residents in Cape Town. And they came together in 2013 after a fire in the township that burned down, thousands of homes and etc. And so they decided to come together to solve their own housing issue. And how they decided to do that was to set up a savings scheme. And so these are, and I really want you to understand the context. These are people living in the most dire of dire situations, right? And they all submit a certain amount of money, whatever they can afford each month, into this pot. They've raised around 1.5 million so far. And I know when you think about over the course of the time, that's probably not a lot, but if you think of the context, that is a lot of money. And the plan is for them to get some land from the government. They're already in negotiations, and to build their own housing. They already have plans. They've consulted architects, developers, etc. Their plan is around 60 pages long. 30 of those pages is environmental approach alone. So the whole, I think the importance of using these indigenous approaches is is there it's holistic by nature, right? It is not. Nothing is an afterthought. The environment isn't an afterthought. The well-being of the people living in that complex or whatever is not an afterthought. Everything is already ingrained, right? There's another site called Madulamocha Housing Association, and I was talking to the founders, and we were talking about some of the sites. You know, they have multiple sites around the country, and it is so purposeful where the sites are, to be close to hospitals, to be close to schools, to be close to universities, to be close to transport networks. It is ingrained, it is automatic. It is not an afterthought. There are automatically in every site community spaces for people to gather, to do whatever with that space that they please. And I suppose, you know, I think that for me is the, I don't know if I've answered your question, because if I'm honest, I forgot it. But I think that's the most important aspect about, you know, putting Indigenous approaches to development, you know, at the forefront. Because they are just holistic by nature, right? And nothing is an afterthought. And community engagement is not an afterthought. You know, whenever you talk about, you know, housing or any kind of development, you know, again, you know, the idea of co-creation and community-led, you know, are again buzzwords in practice and also in academia. You know, they're such buzzwords, but you know, I think in the organizations that I've researched, which are all led by Ubuntu at the forefront, co-creation is not a buzzword. It is ingrained. And yeah, I'll finish there.
I feel like it perfectly answered the question, because it's like Claude mentioned, in thinking about spaces, you're not just thinking about housing, but like, what is it that sustains life in a space? That means that everything that you need is collectively there, thinking about all the people within it and all the things that those people need, and that captures that perfectly. And I also feel that in your answering of why you moved towards community centres as a space, like community centres near housing estates, sort of brings that into the fore as well. So sharing a little bit about the relationships.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, my answer to the question is like in two parts. I think maybe just to like give some detail on our approach to working with communities as kin structures, it's a little counterintuitive, but what we've actually done is, rather than go out to the community like straight away and be like, what do people want? We've actually focused on like key relationships, and those key relations are the stakeholders who have most influence over the building that we want to work in. And so that's the charity, that's just that point, London East, and then the Friends of Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park, who manage the surrounding park. And why we've done that is because rather than create expectations that actually we can respond to needs or aspirations straight away, what we want to do is really understand actually the existing structures around the building, and to really think about actually the relationships which are beneath those current structures, and then actually how much influence we have over them already. And then there's an invitation for people to come into that structure when we've worked out actually how we can influence and move it towards a direction which is more participatory, and which is maybe more radical and forward-thinking. And so I think that's maybe a little unusual, because sometimes in these projects what happens is you ask people lots of questions, you synthesize their answers, and then you sort of have this collaborative vision. But I think the danger of that sometimes is that actually you create an expectation of something which isn't possible to meet. And I think that can be really damaging for communities, especially communities that are often patronized a lot, in that they're not allowed to make decisions on things that matter most to them all the time. And that was just a really key, I guess, principle on which we engaged with the space. And so at this point in the journey, we haven't yet done this massive consultation what we've done is we've integrated into the building, and part of our invitation was to support the charity to actually just improve and make sure that their governance structures were fit for purpose, because they weren't before. And actually, longer term, that would have been a massive risk if we then started to build something that then fell down after 2 years. Another part of it was just clearing out a spare room. So Set Point was so under-resourced that there was half of the community centre, it wasn't possible to use it. So what we did is we cleared out one room. It's one of the 2 main rooms, so it can hold about 30 to 40 people. And we just started to fill it. And we filled it through testing activities. So we had some people, one of them is in the audience now, Hannah, who does work with tea and food. And we had meals in that room. And through that, Hannah bought things like teacups, a kettle. There's like handmade bowls and cups in the room. And actually already through that, we're involving the community and actually and to use like a jargonistic word, but I think it kind of works in this context, like we're co-creating the space. And that comes before us thinking about the bigger vision. It's actually, do people feel comfortable in this space? And how much freedom do they have to be themselves in that space? And so that's where we are on our journey so far. But I think longer term, what we want to think about actually is like, I'm trying to think of a nicer analogy than like a sock, but also like turning a sock inside out. So moving maybe organizations like Set Point, like the Friends, actually like further away from the centers of decision making and bringing community members closer to the center of that. But that's a process that we want to get to. It's not something that we're necessarily able to do yet, I think, honestly, and as powerfully as we'd like to. So that's like the first part of my answer to the question. The second part of it is about like embodied leadership. And we've been really influenced by something called generative semantics. And for people that don't know, generative semantics is like a politicized form of semantics, which is about the body and about how we inhabit the body. And actually the body is like a site of a lot of violence for a lot of us as people from like marginalized, racialized communities. And thinking then about how do we move in this work? Like what behaviors, maybe unlearned unconsciously, are we like reproducing, which maybe don't serve us in the work? And I think, again, there's something for us about, it's not that we have all the answers, but being really conscious about that in how we even like hold meetings. So for example, like when we start meetings nowadays, we always just start by just asking people to just like pause, and often to just like, connect and just think about what sensations are they bringing into that meeting? How has their day been? And that's like a really like small example of like, I guess, a culture shift. But I think in doing that, what we're trying to do is also get away from this like firefighting, also like really policed form of being with each other, which we don't want to exist in this space, which is run and faced by racialized peoples. The board have actually just appointed some new trustees. The board is going to be led by a woman of color. It's like half people of color on the board. And so we want to create safety in this space, but not just by having a space. It's about how we inhabit the space. And in doing that, we want to think about how we then relate to each other. And that's what I mean when I talk about like embodied leadership. And I think Aman and I are really conscious of that. And I think we're just trying to spread that culture throughout these key individuals and then like other people that then hopefully feel like they can like feel at home in this space. And that extends and creates a new culture. Thinking about culture like a small C, like what is culture? Culture is how we are together, it's how we view the world. And for us, a lot of that starts with what we embody. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to combine the last 3 questions I had for you into one question. But I think one of the reasons I'm quite sad that Victoria didn't make it is because the story of taking on an opportunity when it arises. So People Dome Collective kind of like had this opportunity presented to them from the council during 2020 around having a cultural space for Black people in Margate. I'm not going to tell the whole story of their work, but just how that led them to do an incredible level of community organising, build a set of relationships, have a collective vision, but then the precarity of the space, creating relational dynamics within the community because of ultimately being dragged along by the council. And part of that, the conversation was, how do we hold each other, and I feel like you have expressed that so well, like for what purposes, which is like what does the space look like, for longevity, and being able to actually have spaces and assets like in community control, so that we know that we have that space for a long time, and we can actually do the work together, and not create harm as a result of the process itself. So my final question before I take it to the floor, also recognizing I am also really cold, so I'm kind of like doing this. Thanks. There's a mixture of things around like the challenges of going through quite a technical process and the financing. So I'm going to, for you, Angelique, specifically about Black Southwest Network and having control of a community space or a community asset and how you got to that point, but actually like where BSWN are now, what that's enabled, but also what that has brought in terms of challenges. And Kwame, maybe going back to the original purpose of kin structures, and like thinking about, in an ideal world, like a bit more about like where that could go, or where you might like that to go in the future. Now you've had experiences in that space. And Claude, I'd really love you to maybe talk. We talked a little bit about community land trusts and community housing, but to share a bit about like where you see strengths in those models, because those models are different. But actually, like what part of that are you driven towards right now? I don't know if I will remember the questions I've asked you, but a response in that would be great. Maybe let's go to Claude first.
Are you coming back to me first? What I will say with DE, we will be doing a series. We'll be doing a series of workshops, so watch out for that. I did want to talk a little bit about finance, a little bit, and allies, because there will be allies for us within the sector, indigenous allies, because even though the Black and ethnic minority community, people of colour are experiencing this, so are indigenous poor white people. They've got the same issue, but we're not trying to solve it for them. We're trying to solve it for ourselves. So there will be allies in there. When we talk about finance, I think share offers, and I don't know if any of you know about share offers, but share offers are a way that we can fund ourselves, putting out information about share offers. Crowdfunding is a thing that many Black and ethnic minority organizations are not actually touching, and there's opportunities around that. I wanted to go on to mention a little bit about expectations, truth, time, about sometimes the time it takes and being honest with the people that you're working with. Yep, squeeze back in, come in. Don't want you all getting wet. And expectations, giving targets, setting targets and delivering targets along the way. I'm not trying to give the impression that this process is a quick process, because it's not. With Frontline, it took us 6 years from the idea to actually the delivery. So, and some projects I know can take longer than that. But I do want to touch on, before we go into questions as well, and the point, examples, there's self-build, there's cooperatives, there's land trusts, there's co-housing projects, so there's a number of different strands. So when you talk about solving housing issues, you may need to look at which one fits you. Should have brought a bigger umbrella. And what I'd like to, so yeah, it's about housing option. And when it comes to land trusts, because I know some of you, once we talk about this, will do a bit of research. Community land trust comes out of the civil rights movement in America. So way back in the mid-60s, when they didn't have no schools, they didn't have no churches, they didn't have no houses in America, community land trusts were set up as part of solving their issues. And community land trust is something that has migrated to Europe, and Britain has been the last one to engage. If you look across Europe, There are tons of examples of housing projects that solve the issues in France, in Italy, we was in Barcelona last year, Holland, Belgium, all of these areas, France, have community land trust networks that are happening. So do watch out for the workshops we're going to be running later on this month, and I'll be hopefully breaking down the options a bit deeper for those that are interested. Yes, okay, Guppi.
Perfect. Just to say, information about the workshops, which will be happening, I think, in a couple of weeks, so very, very soon, will be up on social media later. And if you missed the session, obviously because you're here, you didn't go to the session next door, but there will be workshops based on that conversation too. So just to encourage you towards those. Well done for that, persisting through the rain. Angelique, because you're working on, or you've been in a building or with an organisation that has sort of sustained a community asset, it'd be really great to hear about a little bit about what you understand that process was and the challenges or expectations that you had to work on as an organisation.
Yeah, so we have, this is Black Southwest Network. We have a building. I think we've just, if I'm not mistaken, it's a 150-year lease. And getting to that point was so, I should say that I wasn't directly involved in it, so I don't want to, take the credit for my colleagues, but it was such a long and arduous and annoying process. The whole way through, there was just barrier upon barrier upon barrier, and so much paperwork and so much to do to get to the point of being able to get this building. And I think, that's probably one of the biggest barriers, when it comes to, being able to access community spaces, is having the time and the resources to be able to go through that journey, because as I said, it was so long and so resource intensive, and when I say resources, I don't just mean, monetary, I mean, in terms of the team, in terms of, time. Because I suppose the issue is that a lot of, Black and minoritized-led organizations are smaller, and they are often very operational, and they are often, there's perhaps one or two people working in the organization. And so having the time and the resources to be able to go through that process of getting a community asset is often impossible for a lot of the organizations.
Could you tell us a bit about the story of the Coach House? Or why that became the place that you guys chose? There's a history to it.
There is a history to it.
Is it a good history or?
It is a good history, but
yeah, okay, that's fine. That's fine. I suggest you look online.
No, I'd love to tell you, but I'm not too familiar with it that much. But it has always been, as far as I'm aware, it has always been a site for small businesses and particularly for
and the neighbourhood of St. Peter's is...
St. Paul's.
St. Paul's, sorry.
Yeah.
So
it's located in St. Paul's in Bristol, which... there's a quite a large African Caribbean community there, as well as others. But as far as I'm aware, that building has always been for small businesses, supporting small businesses, in terms of resources and assisting with funding, etc. So it always has that history. So we're currently now trying to access funding to start the refurbishment of the building. Which, as I was saying earlier, similar to the issue that we're having with the land, it's all well and good, here's the land or here's the lease, and then off you go. It's okay, well, we still need money, right, to actually develop all of that, and so aside from the issue that the barrier that I was talking about earlier in terms of being able having the resources to go through that process. it's also all of that as well, right? Did I answer your question?
Thank you.
I hope so.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, I could just quickly say, also about, if we, whilst we're on the topic of financials, just jumping on the back of something that Claude said, talking about the different models, self-builders, et cetera, a lot of the organizations, in the context of South Africa that I was talking about earlier, there are so many different approaches and so many different models that can be taken to finance, to resource, community assets and those sorts of things, right? So one of the organizations called Lowe, they have a community, they have a second-hand store, they have a restaurant, they have a shop, and something else. And then the funding from that helps them to then subsidize some of the housing that they provide for low-income pensioners, right? There's another one called Communicare, and they rent out some of their properties, and they then use the funding from that at at market rates to then provide subsidized housing for the other 80% of their properties. So there are all of these different models and ways of being able to fund these projects, right? And obviously, in Badu Housing Group, the savings scheme I was talking about as well.
Do you remember the question I asked you?
I think so. Can you repeat it?
Yeah. So based on the sort of initiation of kin structures and what your kind of like hopes were there, I guess where do you see it going, or where do you sort of like dream it to go in the future as kind of either hacking or using alternative methods of holding space for communities?
That's a nice question to be asked. I'm gonna just, every answer I've done has had two parts to it, so I'll just continue that theme. I want to talk a little bit about why art and culture as well. I think it's really important, because for me I'm not just into governance for governance. Do you know what I mean? I mean, governance is serving a function, and I also want to question the term governance in a second, but I'll come back to that. I love the way human beings are able to imagine and represent the world or worlds that don't yet exist. I think it's like a superpower, and not even just politically, just as also just being a human being. I think that makes it, for me at least, enjoyable. And so a lot of my love of this work comes from my love of that power that we all have. And at the same time, I'm also I feel like that power has been almost strangled and policed by the way that it's spatialized, and is often given no value. People are holding their culture all the time. We're always culturally bound, but I think the way that we conceive of cultural space, and that it should be on white walls, or it should be in a museum or a gallery, for it to be true art or culture, is a form of policing. And a big philosophical or political underpinning of the work we do is that actually art and culture should be resourced to exist outside of those spaces, and it isn't currently. And so it's almost for us, it's a sort of an effort to liberate art from those spaces. And it exists, I'm not saying that we're liberating it ourselves, but to really make that resourced and plentiful in a way that I don't think it currently is when you think about cuts to arts funding across the board. And also the idea of everybody being an artist, which I know is a bit of a cliche, but everybody can create. And I think that should be really encouraged. And it shouldn't just happen at school, or it shouldn't just happen in one-off sort of workshops or days that happen and that you have to pay for. And there's something about being able to go to a community centre. And also when I used to work community centre, I also want us to unshackle ourselves from a traditional imagination of a community centre, to think about what would just a really resourced and precious and sacred space, which was in walking distance from your house, look like. And what could you do in that space? What could you do with your friends? What would it look like to not have to consume there? What if you could produce there? And also collectively and not alone. And for me, that's the vision. That's what we're trying to get to. What that looks like in terms of detail, we don't yet know, but that's part of also the work is manifesting that. So that's like the first part of my answer. And I think the second is about how then we think about governance and also like ownership in relation to that. And like I really respect the work that Claude you've done, Angelique that you've done. I think it's so necessary for us, especially as people of colour. But I also want to question the idea of ownership. Like I'd love us to exist in a time when maybe we didn't feel like we needed to like hold things, and that means there's like something which is mine and then something which is not yours. And I also don't want to like romanticize that because we haven't had for so long, you know. So I really hear that and I really respect it, but I'm going to like use the language of somebody called Jackie Tan. He's an artist and a lawyer who does a lot of work around governance. And he talks about this idea of like stewardship and how can we be good stewards. And I think that speaks to like kind of indigenous approaches to the land. And like when I talk about space, I'm also thinking about land, but like in an urban context. And how can we be good stewards to space or land? And that like provokes a whole new set of questions, right? If you're an owner, you've just got it. It's done. But if you're a steward, how do we like maintain this thing and nourish it and grow it so that it's like bountiful for the next generation? And as a parent, I'm a parent. I often think about like it's put my life into perspective. Like we're only going to be here for like hopefully like 100 years, maybe not quite that long. But I often then just think about actually how short that is when you see another life start growing. And actually, when you think about yourself as a steward, there's a responsibility to educate the next generation about also how do they look after something. And I think it's something that actually we're not really taught how to do, which is really crazy. And how do we make things last? And I don't want to waffle too much, but I'm going to try and say a little something else. I've also like really enjoyed reading a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which I'm sure people have heard of. And there's a really beautiful chapter in it about the land and actually about how human beings can like not just like cultivate land, but actually like make it more bountiful. Like we can be like integral to land to yielding more crop and to like holding more life. And that's kind of almost philosophically how I want to see the governance side of the work, is actually how are we like stewards that create more life from this like, it's a relatively small resource. Like a whole building feels like a lot that hopefully we're going to get to. But if we do get that building, then over like 300 years with like hopefully like children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and thinking about this vision for art and culture, like just think of what could happen in that space. And that's for me like, that's what we're moving to. That's the vision.
Beautiful. Yeah, go on then.
Yeah. Yeah, give him a round of applause. Don't be shy, don't be shy. I'd like to come in on the back of that because I think being of that first generation, that Windrush, children of Windrush, that our parents' generation kind of were looked at like 99-year leases. You either purchase or 99-year lease. But there's options really within the system, and I agree with the stewardship of going for when we go for land, we may not purchase it now, we may get a 999-year lease. So if we get a 999-year lease, that more or less says that that's 8-9 generations of our people as a stewardship, rather than just going in there. And sometimes, especially in London, you can't buy land. Or you can buy land, but it's so expensive and the hurdles you have to go through. So to me, we're looking at a system where you go for a 999-year lease. Government can give you that. Local authorities can give you that. What that gives you is that stewardship. It gives you that time. It gives you that potential to pass it on to generations. Because what may happen is one generation may want to do this with the land. The next generation may come up with other ideas that can happen with that land. So I agree with you, some kind of stewardship, but the structure of it, because 99 years doesn't work. It's one lifetime, so that's one generation of people. So that's what we're pitching for now, 999 years. And that's kind of what I'm marketing out to everybody. That's how we have to go at the system, because that gives us stewardship.
Sorry, Guppi, can I say something else? Can I?
You
can say no.
I'm just going to make a point quickly. I've been an outrageous facilitator, and it's 4:30, which means it's 15 minutes till the next plenary, which means that there's no space for questions, which is awful for all of you. So I'm just going to give you... I'm sorry, did someone have a burning question? Oh, you're not going to put your hands up now. Basically, I'm sorry that there is no space for questions, but it's a break. So you guys can chat to these guys as they go and get their teas and coffees before the final session. Is that okay? Please go and then I'll wrap up afterwards. Yeah.
Cool. It's just a quick thing. I was just going to say, Claude, I love the idea of a 999-year lease. Just as a number, I think it's a really appropriate amount of time to be having to think through. But I was just going to also think about ownership models and also ways we can use current structures and legal frameworks around land to even challenge what's possible. And I remember I was reading about a group of freed slaves, I think it was in the South of America, of the USA. And these freed slaves were I think endowed with patches of a former plantation. And rather than just become smallholders of small plots, they collectivized the land. I think they found a way to sign a lease collectively for all of it, and then they registered it under a sort of separate body, so almost like a community land trust. But what they were doing was actually taking the land out of the kind of realm of ownership. And how powerful is that as people that had been bonded to the land without a voice to reject the whole model? And I just feel that's a nice sort of history and story about maybe what we can start to think about. It might not exist now, but actually we can make it possible.
I'm going to give Angelique a last minute. You want to say something and then say anything?
No, I guess it's just a lot of what you were both talking about then. Specifically, you was as you said, ties in perfectly well with this, with indigenous thinking and indigenous approaches to development. And there is no such thing as individual ownership, particularly of land. Historically in South Africa, pre-colonialism, right? There is no such thing. So this idea of stewardship, of whether that be of everything, stewardship is the heart. It's the heart of development philosophy, in Southern Africa, in the indigenous thinking, I think. So I completely agree, is all I was getting to with that really long sentence.
Thank you. We are going to finish up. Again, I'm not normally like this, but I just got really into what you were talking about. But I feel towards the end of that conversation, we really cracked it open, because the point of this particular discussion is we're working with models that drive us towards even the idea that a community has to own a place. And we're still trying to work out how to both move land off the speculative market, challenge the sort of financing systems around land and housing, sustain ourselves as a community as we do that, and then also challenge our own concepts of what our relationship with land and space is, and think of new models that are obviously restricted by what is available to us in the legal frameworks that we exist in. All very complicated, but hopefully that's enticed you to explore more. Like we mentioned, Claude will be running some workshops specifically around what you can do as a community, so collective community land trust, collective ownership, and community housing. And they'll be online soon. And these guys, well, also just want to say particular thank you for Angelique for travelling all the way from Bristol whilst she was sick, and just making it his day. And you're probably going to head home quite soon, so you might not be able to see her so immediately, but I'm sure she would love to be in touch with you, and we can make that happen. Thank you to our panellists. Again, I'm so sorry to all of you for not being able to ask questions.